Hey there guys, we're going to be taking a look at 10 different shooters running on the AMD Ryzen 5 5560U. Now, it's a pretty rare chip that you can really only find in some mini PCs and the Neo Air. Now, this is running on the Beelink SER5, which is a very nice compact mini PC that actually packs quite a bit of punch, especially when you raise its TDP up to 25 watts. And that's what we're going to be testing everything on right now. And what we're looking at running on here is Apex Legends. Now, this is a game that is running at 1080p, and even though it's on the Source engine, it is pretty demanding. Now, the queue times for the Battle Royale were absolutely insane, so I pretty much just switched over to the arena battles, and these were pretty interesting to see because of the fact that it was pretty brutal in terms of performance at the native 1080p resolution. Our averages and 1% low, while close to each other, pretty much made the overall experience of playing this very rough, because playing a fast-paced first-person shooter like this at pretty much 30 FPS is going to be a very daunting experience. And I don't think that the vast majority of people are going to be satisfied playing like this unless you're just really desperate to play this game and you really don't care at all about how it's going to run, but you are going to struggle to really do anything that you would want to do on here. Of course, dropping things down to 720p does improve the overall gaming experience, and it does actually start to get into territory where things are far more playable. But the biggest issue is really the fact that at this low of a resolution, it's extremely hard to see anyone. I was struggling to do anything, even on a 24-inch 1080p monitor, simply because of the fact that it was almost impossible to see anyone at a distance at this low of a resolution. So overall, while I'd say it's playable at this point at 720p, I really don't know if most people are going to be okay playing like this. But if you're someone that's used to playing at 720p, you could pretty much get away with it here. Now, it's nothing remarkable, and of course the 1% lows are going to fluctuate a lot depending on what's going on, so it's not exactly going to be the smoothest experience, but it is at least within a range that would be considered way more playable than where we were at the full 1080p resolution. Now, moving on to the next game, we have Counter-Strike Global Offensive, and this is of course running on a bot match because of the fact that it is pretty much the only way to actually play the game with MSI Afterburner running on the corner there. The game itself does not let you use third-party software unless you disable the protections for that, but then the matchmaking pretty much is ruined. So we're just doing a bot match here, and you can see that while the averages are pretty fantastic, the 1% lows are nothing remarkable, though they are at least within a range where I think most people will be satisfied enough. I don't think that it's going to be anything too remarkable, but if you're really desperate to play this game at the full 1080p resolution, keep in mind this is with the lowest in-game graphics settings. The overall level of performance that we're getting is passable, but it is again nothing remarkable. Though with averages this high, overall the experience is going to be more than enough for a lot of people, and those 1% lows are going to be something that you can very easily adjust to if you play like this pretty consistently. If this is pretty much your only way of experiencing this game, you're going to be able to play it perfectly fine. Of course, there are other things we can do to try to improve those 1% lows, because that is overall what's going to bring down the experience. And of course, what we can do is drop the in-game resolution from 1080p down to either 900p or all the way down to 720p, depending on what you want to do. And at 720p, we do get a nice improvement in the overall 1% lows, where the gaming experience is actually really rock solid, and the bump in the averages is also welcome. It definitely feels significantly smoother to play like this, and it's actually pretty enjoyable. But again, we are dropping the resolution extremely low, though CSGO is not one of those games where you're doing a lot of super long range combat, so having a lower resolution overall does not really ruin the overall experience. But if this was a battle royale where sometimes you can end up having fights with people that are hundreds of meters away, this would be a pretty brutal time. But honestly, playing the game at 720p, it really didn't bother me too much, and the overall improvement in performance was very welcome. So really, it just comes down to personal preference here. I don't think 1080p was unplayable, though it certainly wasn't remarkable. Now, switching over to a far more modern game, we have Ready or Not, a first-person tactical shooter that is running on a far more updated engine, but it actually supports FSR, and we have FSR running here at the performance preset with, of course, all the graphics settings set to the lowest possible. And overall, the level of performance that we were getting was surprisingly decent. The 1% lows weren't anything remarkable, but they were at least above 30. If you look at those frame times, they are relatively consistent, and our averages are also pretty decent. Would I really sit here and play the game like this? I'm not 100% sure, but I do also have a much higher end gaming PC that will let me play this game properly. If I didn't have that, this might just be how I would end up playing the game, and I don't think I would necessarily hate it too much. If I'm used to playing games like this, then this is more than reasonable enough. Of course, there will be fluctuations here and there, but it's just something that you're gonna have to deal with. Really, the most impressive thing to me is what FSR was actually able to do in terms of getting us a playable experience, and visually speaking, it doesn't look anywhere near as bad as I was expecting from a FSR performance preset. Now, I'm not gonna sit here and tell you it's the most beautiful looking game with these settings, but it's definitely not anywhere near as bad as I was expecting it to be. So overall, I'm pretty happy with all of this. Now, moving on to a older tactical FPS game, though it would be a real stretch to call Rainbow Six Siege that at this point. Here we have the built-in benchmark running at both 1080p and at 720p. At 1080p, the results are more than decent and actually pretty playable, with 1% lows that are very close to our averages and very close to 60, while if you look at the frame times, they are very smooth. But of course, if you want to maximize your FPS, 720p here gets you some really nice levels of performance, with 1% lows that are above 100 and frame times that are ridiculously consistent. And overall, the FPS average is pretty much double what we were getting at 1080p. So 720p really starts to shine here, and it ends up being a very nice overall experience. That said, though, gaming at 1080p was more than perfectly fine, and realistically speaking, this is probably how I would just play the game because of the fact that it is the native resolution of the monitor that I was using. If you have a lower resolution one, maybe one that is 900p, then you're going to be able to actually get some more levels of performance here. So it might pay off to pair a mini PC like this with a bit of an older monitor that at least lets you get a bit more FPS smoothness, specifically in the 1% low. Obviously, you're not really going to find any 900p monitor out there that goes up to 120 hertz, but it's about getting those 1% low numbers as high as humanly possible to maximize smoothness. Though I would really think it would be surprising for you to notice a difference between 1% lows in the 50 range and 60 range, because once we get those 1% lows past 60, you're really not going to be seeing any improvement if your monitor does not support this. So overall, I would just recommend playing this at 1080p unless you're really trying to maximize your FPS and you're fine with having a lower resolution and a much smoother experience, especially if you're using something like a 1080p 144 hertz monitor. Maybe having that higher FPS would be better for you, but for me personally, resolution in this case is just better overall. Now, moving on to a bit of a newer FPS, though still at this point quite a couple of years old, we have Star Wars Battlefront 2. Now, this is a game that I love to just jump into and start shooting some droids, some stormtroopers, some rebels, or really whoever is asking to get shot. And the overall gaming experience here at 1080p with the lowest in-game graphics settings is not anything too remarkable, though it's really not as bad as I was expecting this to be. This was actually surprisingly smooth for the overall level of FPS that we were getting here. I was having a decent enough time playing like this. It was enjoyable enough, though I would really recommend lowering the resolution because 1080p might really just be pushing it here, especially depending on the map that you're in. There will be slight variations between maps, so the fact that we're practically on the edge of playability here pretty much means that we don't really have any headroom for fluctuations based off of map, based off of who you're playing, how many enemies are in one location. All of this can really cause some major fluctuations that can make the whole experience pretty rough. So if we drop the resolution down to 720p, you'll see we get a much nicer overall gaming experience here because those 1% lows see a very nice uplift and really give us some headroom here when it comes to different maps, different scenarios, and really just overall however chaotic things end up getting. And of course, if you pay attention to those frame times, you'll see that everything is staying very smooth, very very consistent. Really, this was a extremely nice experience. I absolutely had a blast playing like this, and the game also just looks really nice even at these lower graphics settings. The Frostbite engine really is remarkable when it comes to that. So really, overall, I would say this is one of those games where you're more than likely going to have a great time playing it on here, especially because at 720p, the lower resolution really does not affect much of anything. It just makes things far smoother and the overall experience far better. Overall, I think this game is a pretty big win on this system. Now, I played a little bit of Halo matchmaking here. This is, of course, Halo Reach, and the overall level of performance that we were getting here was decent enough. We were playing, of course, with the original graphics settings, not anything enhanced, but we're also not at the lower graphics settings. This is pretty much the level of quality that you would have expected things to be running at if you were playing this on a console, though at a higher resolution than what it natively ran on the Xbox 360. And the overall level of performance that we were getting here was decent enough, was able to play it fine enough, but nothing remarkable. I was more than happy to play like this though, so I would consider playing Halo and really most of the Master Chief Collection here to be a pretty decent win overall. But I do plan on going more in depth with the entirety of the Halo franchise on this specific system, so we're going to leave it here for now, just taking a nice little teaser of the Halo Reach multiplayer running on here before we go deep into looking at all of the different Halo games, all of their different campaigns, the firefights, and the different online modes for all of the Halo games in the Master Chief Collection. Now, moving on to an FPS game that gives us an overall nicer experience, we have, of course, Valorant. This free-to-play FPS is running incredibly well here with 1% lows in the 50 ranges and averages that are well above 130. It was really overall extremely smooth to play like this, extremely fun. You'll pay attention to the frame times and you'll see that the overall gaming experience is really nice. There will only be small moments of spikes here and there, but for most of the gameplay, things are going to be extremely smooth, and things really only start to drop down whenever it is that you're spawning in. So what that means is that for the moments that you're actually playing and things actually matter, things are going to be extremely smooth and extremely playable. Riot Games really knocked it out of the park this time around with making a FPS game that looks great visually but also runs at incredible levels of performance even on lower end hardware. So really overall huge win for Riot Games and Valorant here. I am really impressed with this, and this is one of those games where it is perfect to play on low-end systems. It really is remarkable, especially because it was able to keep a very consistent and very appealing art style even at these lower settings. And I wish this was something that could be said about Fortnite. Now, Fortnite here is running at the lowest in-game graphics settings with DirectX 11 as the rendering API. Now, after playing quite a few matches on here and getting absolutely abysmal results, hoping that eventually shaders will cache or something will improve these 1% lows, we really were not getting that. Now, the game, when you lower the graphics settings all the way to the lowest preset, what it actually does is set the render resolution to 50%. So if you look at this image and everything looks blurry to you, it's because it's not even running at 1080p. It's running more like 540p. That's a pretty brutal resolution drop considering the 1% lows that we're getting here. They are abysmal. Our frame times are just a disaster. The averages look great, but if I didn't show you 1% lows, you'd think that this was a good experience, and it's just not. It was not fun. It was not playable. Every match that I would join into, it was like this. I was hoping that things would eventually level off, but even after playing 3 matches straight, it was just not improving, and this 4th one here was pretty much the last straw for me. I just could not stomach playing like this anymore. Very disappointed to see how Fortnite has been performing, especially even on my high-end gaming system with an RTX 3070 Ti. I still find myself having some pretty bad 1% lows. Now, nothing this bad, but honestly, for what I spent on that system, you would at least hope it would do a bit better for a game that has a mobile release. Of course, an absolute classic like Left 4 Dead 2 performs incredibly well on this particular system, and these are exactly the kinds of games that I think a system like this would be great for, because it is a low-end system that still has very, very nice levels of performance for day-to-day tasks and a lot of productivity stuff. And you could just jump into this game with your friends and have a very, very nice time. At this point, I'm shocked if anyone doesn't own Left 4 Dead 2. This is an incredible game. The replayability is absolutely insane. And with having mod support through the workshop, this is pretty much one of those games where you will more than likely be playing it for the next 10 plus years, just like a lot of us have been. So overall, the level of performance that we're getting here is remarkable, extremely smooth. It's felt great to play. Absolutely love this franchise, and I really recommend that you try playing games like this on here instead of trying to force newer, heavier titles to run on here at barely playable settings. And speaking of forcing newer games to run at barely playable settings, here we have Overwatch 2. Now, to call this a new game is, of course, a bit facetious, considering that it is just a repaint of the original Overwatch. But there were at least some graphical enhancements that overall made the performance on lower end systems just a little bit worse, and overall it can be pretty brutal at times. Here I'm just doing an AI match, but this is all running with the lowest graphics settings, and the game actually has a dynamic resolution setting by default, so I left that on because I think that the vast majority of people that will play this game are just not going to change much of anything like that. So if we left it with a target FPS of 60, we actually were hitting that in terms of average. But if I show you the 1% lows, like what you can see there, and the frame time chart, you can see that there are moments where things aren't exactly doing great. Our 1% lows being in the low 20s pretty much tells us that the experience is not exactly going to be rock solid 24/7. It's certainly not abysmal, but it's not far from it. If those frame times were just a little bit less consistent, then I would say that this was really in unplayable territory. It really is very map dependent though. It's very map dependent and lineup dependent to see how bad those 1% lows can get. But things are consistent enough most of the time that I can't write this off completely, though again, I would maybe reconsider playing this game on here, and maybe even reconsider playing the game at all. Maybe it's not such a good idea to support games with extremely horrible monetization practices, but maybe that's just me. And of course, we're switching over to the kings of predatory monetization. We have Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 Remastered. Now, of course, this is a campaign-only remaster, but it is one of my favorite campaigns in general in the whole franchise, as disastrous as it's all been over the years. Here we actually have it running with the lowest in-game graphics settings, just to see what we can do in terms of maximizing our FPS here. I would definitely, in general, turn up textures and things like that, as those won't necessarily affect your FPS really all that much. They'll just increase your RAM utilization. But in general, our 1% lows are at a level that it is decent enough to play. It's not going to be anything remarkable, but it is going to be more than playable. And after doing a couple of campaign missions, I could safely say that I could play this perfectly fine on here, and I'll have a more than decent enough time. In general, I find that this specific chip and this specific mini PC work really well when it comes to playing older titles, but newer ones, you're really going to have to stick with esports games and just lighter games in general, maybe a lot of indie games, and we'll actually more than likely end up looking at what kind of games we can actually play on here. I am planning on doing another list like this where it's going to be a bunch of AAA games that you can actually run on this specific system. But in general, I was very impressed to see what the results were in a lot of these games, but there are some outliers where things were pretty brutal. The funniest thing to me though is that Overwatch was running better than Fortnite, especially considering that Fortnite was at pretty much half resolution and Overwatch was more fluctuating anywhere between 75 and 100% resolution. But I hope you found this list of games useful and interesting. It definitely fascinated me to see what you can actually do with a mini PC. But anyways, I will catch you in the next one.